In recent remarks by then presidential hopeful Rand Paul, the senator pointed out an inequity that exists in our country's sentencing laws. Blacks and other minorities are incarcerated at grossly different, higher rates than whites, though in some cases they commit the same crimes at the same rates. Legislation currently before the U.S. Congress attempts to help bring reform to the criminal justice system. And so here to discuss and analyze, we welcome Tamara Lawson, professor of law at St. Thomas University's School of Law, and Mark Dobson, professor of law at Nova Southeastern's Shepherd Broad College of Law. Thanks so much for being here. As Rand Paul sort of observed, of late at least, not only the percentage of the population that is incarcerated in the United States is disproportionately higher than all other developed countries in the world, but minorities, again, are incarcerated at higher rates than whites, even though, as I said at the outset, they commit the same crimes at the same rates. Tamara, why is this?
Well, one issue that wasn't highlighted there is the prosecution of the same crimes at the same rates. So it's the prosecutorial discretion at the front end, not necessarily the sentencing at the back end.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that exactly?
So you said that whites and blacks commit drug possession crimes at roughly the same rates, but they're not prosecuted for those offenses at the same rates. They're not policed, their neighborhoods are not policed at the same rates. So hypothetically, Coral Gables is not policed at the same rate that Opa-laka is policed.
And why isn't that true?
Well, we discussed in the green room,
why doesn't that happen? Why doesn't the police police Coral Gables at the same rate as they do Opa-laka?
Well, I would say there's a racial disparity in policing. There's racial profiling. And there's the belief that it's easier to investigate, prosecute in poorer neighborhoods, which happen to be more black and brown neighborhoods. Also, the crime of possession of drugs, if that's what we're talking about, or use of drugs, is harder to detect in more affluent neighborhoods where you have guard gates and door person. There's less access to find out who's using the drugs. So you might need to do a longer investigation, get a search warrant, do more work to actually investigate and uncover that crime so you can arrest and prosecute. Whereas in poorer neighborhoods where people don't have a door person, don't have a long driveway and a guard gate there, you can access and investigate the citizens in that neighborhood much easier.
Sure. So Professor Dobson, do you agree with that? Is it just a matter of access and ease?
I think it's certainly part of that. You know, we are a society now that's really becoming more and more quantitatively driven. People like to talk about statistics. And law enforcement is like any other segment of that society. It likes to say that if you invest in us, you will get more quote-unquote bang for your buck. So the higher number of arrests that any law enforcement, I'm not picking on any one department or state or federal, can have, then they say, it's doing it. Where are they going to get the number of arrests? Where is it going to be easier to detect crimes? It is going to be easier to detect crimes in the poorer socioeconomic, minority, racial neighborhoods. So therefore, because of that, those are also the neighborhoods where police departments are more likely to invest a higher percentage of their resources. It's kind of like a spiral effect. You know, sheriffs are politicians, and I'm not picking on sheriffs. Police chiefs are politicians. They go before political bodies, city council, county commissions. They want to be able to say, in the last 6 months, we've stepped up our policing, we've done this. A former sheriff in Broward County, Ken Jenney, was incredibly driven by statistics, the number of arrests, the number of crimes detected. So they will invest resources where it's easier to get returns, and those returns are minority neighborhoods.
What can be done about this, or what is being proposed about correcting the inequity,
well,
if anything?
In the law that I think Rand Paul was talking about, as far as policing decisions, I don't see anything. I think the inequity that's been suggested to correct is on not the front end, but the back end of the process, the sentencing end of the process, to give judges more discretion to lower sentences for nonviolent crimes and to make retroactive an earlier law that did away with the disparity in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine.
But racial
Go ahead,
disparity
Tamara.
is not going to be eliminated by the reform bill, even if it passes. It's more of an economic issue, I think.
And education.
Well, no, I mean economic issue of how many people can we incarcerate, and
Oh, I
that's
see.
why they're looking to reform the sentencing level. But if you've got racial profiling at the front end, if you have prosecutorial decision making that puts people in mandatory sentencing offenses, that's not going to change who gets sentenced more harshly later. Also, when we were talking about...
So are you disagreeing then with this bill in lowering mandatory sentences
No, I'm
or
in
sentences for
agreement with
non-violent crime?
lowering mandatory minimums and even eliminating
Right.
mandatory
But
minimums.
you're saying this is not going to have any effect on the rate at
on the
which...
racial disparity
Gotcha.
that was quoted or was attached to this particular reform.
Gotcha.
And also, I think when you were talking about investigating different neighborhoods, when we're looking at quotas or like looking at how many arrests or citations you're going to yield on your shift, which a lot of police departments look at that. As we were saying, if it takes more effort to arrest someone in a more affluent neighborhood, that's not a good use of your time, and it's hard to justify it when you're looking for strict numbers of citations, arrests, etc. But it is instead, if you're looking at equity and enforcing the law as it relates to that offense, you're going to have to invest more resources. In other neighborhoods, or look at how you investigate certain crimes differently in different areas.
So, I mean, how do you then shift? How do you shift that? Is it just a matter of cultural shift within the sheriff's office, within the county's office about the priorities? But I mean, obviously it's an economic thing for them too, because they're going to have to pay for the added costs associated with investigating areas that are hard to access, like white, affluent, Coral Gables, et cetera. What do we do? I mean, I guess we need more legislation to invest more monies then into crime units to then correct the inequity?
Well, maybe we need, as I tell my students,
what do we do to correct the inequity?
as I tell my students, maybe we need an attitude adjustment. Maybe we need to.
How does that come about? How
We
do you
really
do
need to
that?
think that this crime is what we're attacking instead of neighborhoods. If we think that possession of drugs or use of drugs is equally an offensive violation of our law, then we need to invest that way. Or do we instead think, because we're not willing to invest that type of investigation resources in affluent neighborhoods, maybe that's not the crime we should focus on in poor neighborhoods either.
Okay.
We should focus on serious crimes, just like the reform bill does. If we want to reduce, the amount of sentencing for minor offenders, for people with low criminal records, prior criminal records, we want to do that across the board.
Fair point. Professor Dobson, what do you think about that?
Well, I would agree with that. I would also say, going back to the reform bill, my colleague said she views it as economics, and so do I, a lot. But hopefully we view it as common sense, that do we really need to incarcerate people who are nonviolent for substantial periods of time? And if the answer is no, then why are we doing it? It does not make sense to do that. Now, there are some people who are incarcerated for substantial periods of time, and they deserve to be incarcerated, and we have to incarcerate them, okay? A serial sexual predator who is really not going to be reformed, that person has to be incarcerated for a long period of time. There's just no other choice. But, so I would say this is not about correcting racial disparity. I think it's partially economics. I think it may have, with some of the retroactive effect of that Fair Sentencing Act, with the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, it may have an indirect effect of taking care of the racial disparity. But I certainly don't think that's the aim of the bill at all.
Right. It's interesting because relatively there is bipartisan support on this, but now of late it seems to be hung up, though. Republicans are blocking it in the Senate right?
From what I understand,
What's the confusion there? Why are they objecting?
well, from what I understand, first of all, you mentioned bipartisan support. The head of the committee that it's coming out of the Senate, Senator John Kyle from Arizona, would be considered a very conservative Republican. From what I understand, the potential barrier or block is not coming out of the committee, it's whether it will be put before the full Senate for vote, and I believe it's the head of the Senate right now, the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, who has some reservations, who must be convinced about
And do we know what those reservations are?
I do not, so
Okay.
I cannot speak
All right,
to
we'll
them.
have to look more into it. I think we offered some really, really interesting insights here and some policy and some policy suggestions to address this. And I brought it on today's topic because it is deeply an ethical issue, not just a legal one. But unfortunately, we're out of time for today's program. I'm so sorry. We'll have to continue this on social media. Analyze, we welcome Tamara Lawson, Professor of Law at St. Thomas University's School of Law, and Mark Dobson, Professor of Law at Nova Southeastern's Shepherd Broad College of Law. Thanks so much for being here. As Rand Paul sort of observed of late at least, not only the percentage of the population that is incarcerated in the United States is disproportionately higher than all other developed countries in the world. In recent remarks by then presidential hopeful Rand Paul, the senator pointed out an inequity that exists in our country's sentencing laws. Blacks and other minorities are incarcerated at grossly different, higher rates than whites, though in some cases they commit the same crimes at the same rates. Legislation currently before the U.S. Congress attempts to help bring reform to the criminal justice system, and so here to discuss and analyze, minorities, again, are incarcerated at higher rates than whites, even though, as I said at the outset, they commit the same crimes at the same rates. Tamara, why is this?
Well, one issue that wasn't highlighted there is the prosecution of the same crimes at the same rates. So it's the prosecutorial discretion at the front end, not necessarily the sentencing at the back end.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that exactly?
So you said that whites and blacks commit drug possession crimes at roughly the same rates, but they're not prosecuted for those offenses at the same rates. They're not policed, their neighborhoods are not policed at the same rates. So hypothetically, Coral Gables is not policed at the same rate that Opelika is policed.
And why isn't that true?
Well, we discussed in the green room,
why doesn't that happen? Why doesn't the police police Coral Gables at the same rate as they do Opelika?
Well, I would say there's a racial disparity in policing. There's racial profiling. And there's the belief that it's easier to investigate, prosecute in poorer neighborhoods, which happen to be more black and brown neighborhoods.